Very few public health officials in this country seem very interested in public health, in case you haven't noticed. The Surgeon General of Florida, Dr. Joseph Ladapo, is an exception to that. He is interested in the health of the people of his state, and because he's taken a close look at what's in the COVID vax, the one that everyone in the country was required to take not so long ago. And he's come up short. He can't answer some basic questions about it, and that's a concern if we're doing science, which he is. And so he has now called on doctors to immediately stop giving the mRNA COVID vax to their patients, and for a very interesting reason that you should know about. Here's his statement. We're quoting. I'm calling for a halt to the use of mRNA COVID-19 vaccines. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have always played it fast and loose with COVID-19 vaccine safety. But their failure to test for DNA integration with the human genome, as their own guidelines dictate, when the vaccines are known to be contaminated with foreign DNA, is intolerable. Think about that. It's one thing if it gives you a heart attack. If it tampers with your DNA in some way, now we have a real problem, considering 1 billion people got it. So in a recent interview about the mRNA vaccines, the Surgeon General of Florida described them this way.
These vaccines have DNA in them. Everyone knows what DNA is. They're contaminated with DNA, and that's not necessarily a big deal. But it's a problem with these vaccines because the DNA hangs on with the mRNA and goes into people's cells. So this is a completely different risk analysis than other products that have had DNA. These vaccines are honestly, they're the antichrist of all products.
The antichrist of all products. The Surgeon General of Florida joins us now to explain what he means. Doctor, thank you so much for coming on. I remember at the beginning of the vax mandates, there were people on the fringes, as we say, who raised questions about the potential of this drug, this brand new, this novel vaccine, which wasn't really a vaccine, to affect people's DNA. And they were immediately described as crazy. Tell us your concerns, if you wouldn't mind fleshing out a little bit what we saw in that clip.
You know, it's so interesting to hear you say that, Tucker, because I had the same impression when people very early on were citing concerns about DNA. I think that really what was happening is that their intuition was informing them about a potential problem with these vaccines. And, you know, you showed that clip there. This one is sometimes I feel quite guilty dragging people through the scientific details, but I try and do it at a level that hopefully won't bore people to death or be too painful, because it is a very important issue, and it's not a complicated issue. And it's important for people to recognize the difference between the honest facts, which is what I'm sharing, and the spin and dodge and look over here that you hear Dr. Califf at the FDA and other, Dr. Offit, other people sharing. So it's actually very simple. We all know what DNA is. This is our genetic blueprint, our gift from God. And this DNA can be affected, and that can be obviously a very bad thing. Sometimes it's affected in a way that makes people sick. Sometimes it can even be affected in a way that leads people to pass on characteristics to their offspring. In this particular case with the mRNA vaccines, they have DNA in them like many other vaccines or other biologic type of medications. And that, as I've said previously, is not such a big deal, because fortunately DNA is not some big hairy monster that can live forever when it's foreign in people's bodies. Our bodies have lots of mechanisms to break them down. But the problem here is that for the same reason that scientists won a Nobel Prize, this DNA isn't like other DNA in terms of having a very hard time penetrating into cells. This DNA hangs on with mRNA in that lipid nanoparticle that people hear and frankly probably roll their eyes over. It hangs on with it, and it comes into the cells almost certainly hitchhiking along with the mRNA. So whereas in the past, DNA would have a very hard time even entering cells, here the DNA is getting delivered into cells with the lipid nanoparticles. And that's a problem. And that's a problem because each dose of mRNA COVID-19 vaccine probably contains, it's been estimated, between billions and hundreds of billions of fragments of DNA. So this is a completely different risk analysis. That is obvious. You don't need a PhD to be able to figure that out. And the FDA's own guidance about contaminating DNA, published guidance, their words, never referred to by them, by the way, in their counter-arguments, but their words are that there are situations when you need to confirm that DNA that is a contaminant or foreign DNA is not integrating into human DNA, into the human genome. And there are specific tests, sequencing tests, to do this, to make sure it's done. And what we did is we asked the FDA, well, have you done this? You've acknowledged this risk. Have you done this? And they came back with about 10,000 words talking about everything from what time the sun sets in China to, their third cousin's, bar mitzvah, and nothing about the specific question we asked, along with other questions, by the way, but nothing about that, which leads me to conclude they haven't done it, which is, it starts at crazy, but it ends at somewhere else. That someone could be just so nonchalant and frankly willy-nilly with something as precious and as as sacred as our human DNA. So that's a summary, Tucker.
Do you think it's conceivably possible that the mRNA vaccines change people's DNA, or could?
It's absolutely possible. I mean, I wouldn't have issued this call to halt their use if that wasn't possible. On a factual basis, it is absolutely possible. There's zero question about that. Now, the real question is whether it is happening, if it is happening, the degree to which it's happening, the location of affected cells, and the potential for that to cause, whether it's cancer or heritable characteristics, or that is to say that is it affecting things like a woman's eggs or a man's sperm, such that it could be passed on, or whatever else it potentially could be causing. But it absolutely is a possibility. There's zero question about that. The real question is whether it's a possibility worth investigating. The obvious answer is yes, even though the FDA and Peter Marks, wants you to believe that the answer is no.
Well, that would change humanity if that were happening forever.
And frankly, just considering the evil frequency from the beginning of this pandemic, the lockdowns, the forcing people to stay at home, the not allowing people to say bye-bye to people they love, just all the horrific things, the firing of people who stuck it out during the pandemic but then passed on the vaccine after the vaccines were available. All the evil that has defined the frequency of policies during this pandemic, sadly, I hate that is a possibility, but sadly, I would not be at all surprised. In fact, I think it's probably likely that is in fact happening.
You think it's likely happening that humanity itself is being changed forever by this round of mRNA vaccines?
Yes, I do. And that's based on just the things that I just said and the fact that it is possible. So again, the question is it actually happening? And frankly, my instinctive feeling is that totally it's happening. The extent to which it's happening, the degree to which it's happening, any particular lots for which it's worse or sort of less prominent. And those are questions that should be characterized. But if I had to place a bet on what the likely answer to that question is, yeah, I do think that it's probably happening. I think it would be right in step and in sync with every terrible, horrible thing that we've seen happen during the pandemic as a result of people abandoning common sense, abandoning reason, abandoning humanity in pursuit of whatever their ideological or profit-fueled or greed-based or greed-fueled desire is. Yeah, I think it would be quite consistent with that.
Well, I'm shocked, but I guess I'm not that shocked. So let me say something I've never said to anybody, but I've just noticed, and it always has felt a little crackpot to me, so I've never expressed it. Do you think it's possible that after getting the mRNA shot, that people's personalities might change in ways that you would notice?
We're going to enter a spiritual domain here, Tucker. So I am, as you know, I went to medical school at Harvard. I got a PhD while I was in medical school. I've had multiple NIH grants, did research full-time along with taking care of patients before entering this position as Surgeon General of Florida, thanks to Governor DeSantis. And I've got to tell you that, during the pandemic, you'd sometimes hear people say that this is a spiritual war. And it's a funny thing for people to say, but instinctively and intuitively, I remember the first time I heard it sort of yelled out in the middle of a press conference with Governor DeSantis out here in, I think, Bradenton, Florida. I responded immediately that yes, to the person in the audience who said, yes, it is a spiritual war. And it absolutely is. And this has to do with intuition. Again, I've left the MD, PhD hat, and I'm talking just as a human being and someone who, like many of us, guide their lives based on how they feel, what they feel about what truth is and what resonates. And I got to tell you that truly, I think in terms of the toll, we've heard different estimates for their potential contribution to excess mortality. I think that probably is the case, that they contribute. And I think that is just a part of what is, frankly, bad and evil behind the intention of these mRNA COVID-19 vaccines and the whole entire pandemic policy approach. And I got to tell you that I do believe that it can change things that you would not expect to change from people just taking a typical vaccine like the flu vaccine.
So not just their physical health, but also their mental state. I mean, I guess why wouldn't it?
Right, yeah. And I actually wouldn't say so much mental. And again, we are, this is Joe, the dad and the husband and the man speaking with you here. But yeah, there's unfortunately there's absolutely an evil underlying frequency to these products. And, it's something that I felt early, but just over time and frankly, with my own spiritual development and spiritual growth and power, in terms of my connection to, God and other people, and just to the gifts that God gives each of us, and with each of us having different degrees of access to those gifts because of our journeys in life. These mRNA COVID-19 vaccines, and I'm talking about the technology in general. I'm not talking about other technologies. I'm talking about these particular products. Unfortunately, yes, early on, no doubt, were they effective at reducing illness from COVID-19? Yeah, the data were very strong. Now it's completely unclear. There's data that actually points the opposite direction in terms of negative effectiveness and lots of other problems. But despite what they may have provided in terms of benefits specifically targeted toward COVID-19 illness or death, they have caused much worse in terms of not only adverse events, but also, again, at a spiritual level, there's something that I intuitively am certain is wrong with this particular technology and these particular products.
Well, of course, I couldn't agree more. But back just briefly to the public policy questions around this. So, one, didn't the U.S. government, the Biden administration, the Trump administration before them, have an obligation to tell the population, to tell the world, this product that we're going to force you to take could change your DNA, or that foreign DNA is going to enter your cells? I mean, because I think we know that to be true. And I don't believe
Absolutely.
that anyone knew that in the public. Why wouldn't they tell us that?
Yeah, so you're right. Pardon me. And, it goes back to the Trump administration and, Dr. Fauci and other people who were involved in Operation Warp Speed. And it goes all the way back there. And, again, Tucker, I think what helps make this make sense, a sad sense, is that, you look back at the forces, incredibly powerful forces that were exerted and projected on the earth. And, and the populations on this earth at the start of this pandemic, incredibly powerful forces in terms of their imposition of a view about how to approach the pandemic that consumed everything. And part of what it consumed was common sense. Part of what it consumed was prudence. Part of what it consumed was good judgment. Part of what it consumed was human-centeredness. Part of what it consumed was heart-centeredness. And so when you have all of those things happening, then stuff that's obvious, like, there's DNA and, now it's with lipid nanoparticles. So it's not like other vaccines. This is DNA that is almost certainly going to make it into your cells. Billions of fragments of it with each dose. And this is not even mentioning the SV40 enhancer promoter DNA that was part of Pfizer's, that is a specially bad type of DNA in terms of entering people's cells. Those are obvious questions, but with all those forces that were exerted, and unfortunately no force that was loud enough and strong enough to counterbalance it, there were people that you know of, I was one of them too, who early on were saying, this doesn't make sense, slow it down, slow your roll, let's think about things, let's be sensible, let's be human-centered. Those voices were no match at that time for the forces that were being exerted and pressed onto the consciousness of the population. And so basic important things never got asked, like, what do you do when you close the lockdown? What does it mean when you stop kids from being able to play outside? What does it mean when you stop young people from being able to pursue their dreams and their education and whatever other pursuits they have in mind? Those things were squeezed out because of the forces that were in place.
Really one of the most shocking conversations I've ever had in my life. The Surgeon General of Florida, Dr. Joseph Ladapo, thank you very much for joining us.
If
you've ever watched a White House press briefing, you know for a fact that Karine Jean-Pierre doesn't like you at all. But don't feel bad, because she despises someone else more. She really dislikes a specific reporter from Africa. His name is Simon Atiba. He works with Today News. He's had a lot of hostile encounters with Karine Jean-Pierre for some reason. Yesterday, she freaked out on him and stormed out of the press conference, ending it early. So we kept track of this weird psychodrama going on. Here are some clips from it.
She's asking about the origin of COVID.
I hear the question.
And Dr. Fauci is the best person to answer that question.
I hear your question, but we're not doing this the way you want it. This is the disrespectful. It is. I'm done. Simon, I'm done. Simon, I'm done. I'm done with you right now.
What's the difference between President Trump not doing anything while the Capitol was being attacked and President Biden not doing anything while protesters, while the Supreme Court justices were under attack?
To say that there is no difference, that is just unbelievably wrong.
But is it concerned that Supreme Court justice?
I'm moving on. I'm moving on.
You don't give us questions.
Okay. I'm trying to answer your question. Go ahead, sir. Go ahead. I just tried. You wouldn't let me. Go ahead.
No, but can
I just tried, and you would not let me, sir. So your colleague is going to ask a question. Go ahead.
Ask you a question.
No, I literally just tried to answer your question. You shut me down. So now your colleague is going to.
Let me ask the question first before you answer.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow.
Question on the respect for marriage.
It's a good thing she's unarmed, or Simon Atiba would be in deep trouble. He's his correspondent for Today News Africa, and obviously kind of a hero. He joins us tonight. Simon, thank you so much for coming on. Wait, you can feel it watching that tape. She is mad at you. Why do you think that is?
Yes, first of all, thank you, Tucker, for having me on your show. There's a reason why your show is the most watched show in news in the U.S., because you bring people like me. It's been a disaster, a total catastrophe, a real nightmare covering the Biden White House. Right now, I'm the voice of Africa in the U.S., but I can confirm that the level of discrimination against me and against African journalists in the White House, it's outstanding. It's disgraceful. You know, it's been 3 months that we don't have questions at the White House. Even as President Biden is about to receive 50 African heads of state in D.C. for the U.S.-African Summit, she didn't even give us even a single question. I've been trying for the past 3 months. And, you know, it's shocking because she's black. She's an immigrant. I'm black. I'm also an immigrant. And she's discriminating against me more than the white people who were, the white lady who was there before. And it's shocking. She should be ashamed of herself for doing that. And it's heartbreaking.
She's obviously a bigot. You can see it in her face. She really, really dislikes you. Do you suppose it's because you don't have the same views that someone who looks like you should have, in her opinion?
Yes, so I believe that has to do maybe with 2 or 3 things. The first thing, I sound different. I wasn't born here. I was born in Cameroon. I speak French. I speak different languages. I don't have the American accent. I tried, I failed, and I've decided to stick with my accent. So I'm an immigrant, and she doesn't like that. And I ask tough questions. For instance, I will ask her, how is it understandable that President Biden is inviting 50 African heads of state to the U.S. who will spend almost $50 million each, and he doesn't have 5 minutes to spend with each of them? He won't have any one-on-one with any of those African presidents who are coming here in countries where money is already a big problem. Why not have this meeting on Zoom, for instance, you know, and so I asked questions about COVID. How do you explain that 1 million people, if we have to go by the official figures, 1 million Americans were killed by COVID, and we don't know where COVID came? You lied to us. You told us the COVID came from bat to human, and then now we understand that it probably came from the lab, and that's the most consequential question. And she wouldn't even allow Diana from, you know, Daily Caller to ask that question. And when I intervened and said that, no, you need to allow her to ask the question, you know, I'm being blacklisted, and it's unfortunate, it's disgraceful.
Well, you are always welcome on this show, and I suspect we will see you again. Simon and Tiba, thank you so much. We're on your side. More news next. Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson. Tonight we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of the Biden administration. If you can even believe it, seems like a day. Pete Buttigieg has been there almost the whole time. He was sworn in early February of 2021. And when he was, he had high hopes. We looked at the tape today. Though he had no previous experience with transportation, or for that matter with secretarial work, Buttigieg held up his right hand and swore an oath to Kamala Harris to be the best darn Secretary of Transportation he could be. And he seemed to mean it, but not for long. Sadly, history soon intervened. Just weeks into the job, Buttigieg discovered that some of the roads he was supposed to be overseeing, the roads he was now secretary of, were in fact racist. And not just low-grade, got drunk and wrote an insensitive Facebook post 10 years ago racist. Not that kind of racism, no. These were hardcore David Duke-level, nasty old segregationist roads. These were roads that refused to respond to reason and clearly had no intention of changing and joining the 21st century. Some of these roads literally had white stripes painted on them. White stripes. Jim Crow stuff. Buttigieg seemed shocked by the whole thing. They don't have roads like that back in South Bend, Indiana. So for Pete Buttigieg, it was a pivot point. It was one of those moments of profound disillusionment, so common to high-minded young newcomers to Washington, where everything changes in an instant. All your preconceptions washed away. Here he'd sworn an oath to take care of the roads, but learned the hard way that some roads are beyond repair. They are too racist to fix. So Pete Buttigieg embarked on another path. He became one of America's foremost religious leaders. As an Episcopalian, it was not an easy transition. Traditionally, members of the clergy believe in God. But Buttigieg had a characteristically clever solution, an approach he had learned during his years as a McKinsey consultant. In place of the concept of an omnipotent, loving God who brings justice to the world, Buttigieg simply substituted the word climate. Thanks be to climate. Our climate, who art in heaven, that kind of thing. And it sounded pretty good. Here's one of his sermons.
You talk very openly about being a person of faith. And I want to understand how you connect that to this issue of climate change and our custodianship of the earth and our moral responsibilities.
Climate is a moral issue, and this is about stewardship. It is about justice. There's a moment here where we should invite those who are motivated by religious, moral considerations, to know that those are some of the things that are at stake in what we're doing to this planet.
So this was really a milestone in modern Christian theology. Climate, declared Father Buttigieg, is a moral issue, not a meteorological matter, not even a policy topic. It's a moral issue. Climate is a question that bears directly on the fate of your immortal soul. When you mistreat the climate, you risk damnation. Insomuch as you have done to the least of these, you have done it to the climate. Big change. You thought it was about the science. Actually, it's about morality. Okay, Reverend Pete, so you set the terms here. So how's your climate record? That seems like a fair question, given that you've just told us that we will go to hell for our carbon emissions. So let's see how you're doing. Fox News Digital just got a hold of the Reverend Pete's travel schedule, a list of trips he's taken since getting the job at the Transportation Department. And it turns out that Reverend Pete is the Jimmy Swaggart of climate clergy. He was commanding you not to do it, at the same time he was doing it himself in a very big way, way more than you've ever thought of doing it. Reverend Pete has sinned, oh boy has he, in a dark and very naughty way. In less than 2 years, Buttigieg has flown private at taxpayer expense nearly 20 times. He's jetted to Ohio and Florida and New Hampshire, among other places. In September, Buttigieg took an FAA jet to a Canadian gay rights ceremony to accept an award for his LGBTQ+ advocacy, something else he's been doing since he gave up on the roads. All this has been extremely expensive for you and every other taxpayer. You may recall that Donald Trump's HHS Secretary, Tom Price, lost his job for doing exactly the same thing. An outraged Politico.com drove him out of office. So it's expensive. But that's not the real crime. The real crime here is against the climate. It's a sin. It's a moral transgression, because none of these planes that Pete Buttigieg was jetting around on were solar powered. Not a single one ran on a windmill or recycled French fry oil. They were all fossil fueled, all of them. And there is likely no mode of transportation in the history of machines that emits more carbon than private air travel. That would include long trips across India on coal-fired locomotives. Private jet travel stands alone. Private jets emit an average of 2 tons of carbon dioxide in an hour, per hour. For perspective, that's 14 times more carbon emissions per passenger than the JetBlue flight you're on, or any other commercial flight. So you might as well start a tire fire to heat your house. That would be better for the atmosphere than what Pete Buttigieg is doing. Traveling by private jet is literally the last thing that Father Pete should ever do. But we shouldn't be surprised that he's doing it. You may remember that last year, when Pete Buttigieg was busted commuting in a carbon-belching SUV, one of the vehicles that destroys the climate, then unloading a bicycle from the back seat for a short, widely photographed ride to the White House. You're seeing that footage on your screen now. Now, that should have been the very first tip that Reverend Pete's sermons and the self-described climate activists who applauded those sermons are all entirely fraudulent. And in fact, they are fraudulent. Roughly half of all emission created by airplanes are emitted by the richest 1% of the population flying private, the great majority of these Biden voters and big fans of, you guessed it, the Reverend Pete Buttigieg. This year alone, to pick but one among many examples, Steven Spielberg, who said he's terrified of climate change, emitted over 4,400 metric tons of carbon from private jets. How much is that? That's 600 times more emissions than the average person emits in a year. Another climate activist, Taylor Swift, nearly doubled Steven Spielberg's total. 8,000 metric tons of CO2 in a year. All of them destroying the planet, rising the seas, an offense against Mother Earth. Now, Taylor Swift justified it by saying, oh, I loan out jets sometimes. Oh, it's okay. But it's not okay, not if you claim to believe in climate change. A 50-minute flight on a private jet can emit as much carbon as the average person's car does over an entire year. 50 minutes! So imagine what a flight from D.C. to LAX does, or more likely from Hamptons to Aspen. And then imagine thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of these flights, all carrying people who claim they believe that climate change is, quote, existential. It's not a mistake, it's intentional, it's a statement, and it's quite a statement if you think about it. If you're yapping about carbon emissions and climate and then flying private, what you're really doing is hoisting a screaming middle finger to the country, to the plebes below in their SUVs, which you say you plan to ban. And not just in this country, we've got it easy. The economies of entire nations around the world are being destroyed right now in the name of fighting climate change at the behest of people who fly private. So people are going hungry and freezing to death around the world so that Pete Buttigieg and his friends won't have to walk through the magnetometer at the TSA checkpoint. I don't mean to single out the Reverend Pete, though he is certainly the most self-righteous of the group. They're all doing it. Is there a single high-level climate activist who doesn't fly private? At the recent climate summit, more than 400 attendees flew in privately, not on JetBlue, in their own planes. Jeff Bezos is one of them. He flew in his private jet, so did Boris Johnson. John Kerry was famously busted flying to a climate summit in Iceland on his personal Gulfstream. But don't worry, he had no choice. He's too important. Watch.
It's the only choice for somebody like me who is traveling the world to win this battle. I believe the time it takes me to get somewhere. I can't sail across the ocean. I have to fly to meet with people and get things done.
Oh, someone like me. You never heard of Zoom, pal? You should be in jail by your own standards. You're a climate criminal. You're a climate criminal. You should be in prison by your own standards. Not just him. Virtually every recognizable person in American politics and entertainment flies private. Nancy Pelosi flies private. Barack Obama flies private. Leonardo DiCaprio, famous, flies private. You know who flies private? A lot? Al Gore flies private. Michael Bloomberg, boy, does he fly private. In a 4-year period, the UN climate envoy, Mr. Bloomberg, took more than 1,700 private flights, burning more than 10,000 metric tons of CO2. You could never do that. If you filled your yard with diesel engines and never turned them off, you would not do that. Your car emits less than 5 metric tons of CO2 a year. So this is meaningful. This is an actual offense against Mother Earth and the climate. So you have to wonder what the defenders of climate think of this. What about the climate warriors at Greenpeace and the Sierra Club and the Environmental Defense Fund? Have they noticed this? Not really. Have they scolded their donors for undermining their core message? No, of course not. Catherine Clark, the incoming Democratic Party House Whip, doesn't complain either. She should be, because her own child has nightmares about climate change.
Let me tell you what it means to me, coming in as a different generation. I remember my middle child waking up with nightmares over concern around climate change.
Terrorized your own children, you scared the crap out of little kids about climate. So you must be very upset about what Pete Buttigieg is doing to climate by flying private, which is the most destructive thing you can do to climate other than signing off on the sabotage of a Russian natural gas pipeline, which I guess they also did. But who's noticing? But she's not worried about it. Catherine Clark doesn't care, and neither do her donors, including the environmental activists who send her all that money. Meanwhile, a lot of young people are very upset about climate. They believe Pete Buttigieg. And you know what they're doing? They're destroying some of the greatest artwork in Western civilization because they want you to know how important the climate is. So groups like that, those thugs, those monsters, the Stalinist mobs, didn't appear out of nowhere. It's not organic, of course. They were whipped into a frenzy by John Kerry and Nancy Pelosi and Pete Buttigieg. Those were their inspiration. But what's interesting is they're destroying the things that are most valuable in our society. Our art, the legacy of our civilization. But you know what they haven't done? They haven't said a single word about Al Gore's personal Gulfstream or John Kerry's or Pete Buttigieg. Well, that's weird, isn't it? They're attacking our civilization's art, but they're not saying anything about the people who are actually destroying the climate. And you know who else isn't? BlackRock. The ESG score that you keep hearing about? Your flights on private planes have no effect on an ESG score. Really? The E is for environment. But BlackRock doesn't say a word. Could it be that the climate movement isn't really about the climate or about the environment? Could it be that the climate movement is really about creating a permanent caste system where the people at the top of society, the Brahmins, can do literally whatever they want? Can violate with impunity the standards they impose on others while endlessly lecturing and oppressing the population that supposedly runs the country, but of course actually doesn't. Could it be? Oh, it's possible. We called Pete Buttigieg's office today and asked how you can justify flying private as the earth warms and the seas rise. How are you not a climate criminal? Speak slowly so we can understand. Of course, they didn't explain. But the rest of us should impose this as a litmus test going forward. No one who seeks to impose carbon rationing on another human being should ever be allowed to step within 100 yards of a private aircraft. Period. Anyone who claims to be serious about fighting climate change should demand tomorrow morning a federal law against private air travel. Make it illegal. It's that simple. Then go ahead and fly commercial with everyone else or stay home. What's the argument against that? Well, here's what you do know. Anyone who lectures you about climate and opposes banning private air travel is a total fraud and should be ignored. Joe Bastardi is a meteorologist, not a fraud. He's also the author of The Weaponization of Weather in the Phony Climate War. Joe, thanks so much for coming on. I'm not sure you buy the whole program that they're laying out here, but let's just say for a moment that you did, that you really thought carbon emissions were causing climate change and it wasn't just one of the many cycles this Earth has seen over the past 20 million years. Let's say you believe that. Why wouldn't you be mad at Pete Buttigieg and everyone else who flies private?
Well, I don't know. I've been giving this a lot of thought today because I had to drive from Iowa City all the way to Pittsburgh. And when I went by South Bend, oddly enough, it hit me. There are three possibilities here, in my opinion, just looking at this, okay? First is they've all got climate vaccines. We don't know about them, but unlike the COVID vaccine, they actually work. So whatever they do, they're immune from it. So that's a possibility. That's a long shot. The second, Tucker, is that if bad weather stops air travel, it stops car travel. If you can cause more bad weather, right, then guess what? Everybody can't drive. For instance, next week and the week after, watch how much bad weather comes into the United States. It's going to be the coldest, snowiest period around the Christmas time since 2000. So we're going to see planes and trains and all these other things shut down. So if you just dump all this CO2 in the atmosphere and your assumption is, hey, CO2 causes bad weather, if I can cause more bad weather, then guess what? Other people won't be able to fly, will have less CO2 emissions. Or the third possibility, exactly what you said. It's a phony climate war. It's fraudulent. You could tell back when we talked back in July, we were talking about it's going to get cold early this year across the United States. That has nothing to do with CO2. What it has to do is the natural cycles of the weather. And what's happened is these people have taken advantage of people who fall prey to this, and this is what they're doing. There's no logic or reason for it, except they are trying to establish a caste system that destroys the greatest experiment in freedom and individuality, which is this country right here in the United States.
Of course. I mean, if you really believe that carbon was a pollutant, you would be planting pine and spruce and hemlock and evergreens across the country, but they're cutting them down to make way for highways and dollar stores. So it tells you they're frauds. Joe Bastardi, great to see you tonight. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
There's so much going on tonight, and we took that detour because we couldn't resist. But we have a Fox News alert for you. Trace Gallagher is tracking two major updates to two major stories that we've covered recently. He joins us now. Hey, Trace.
Hey, Tucker. First breaking news out of the Bahamas, where FTX founder Sam Bankman-Fried has now been arrested, and Bahamian authorities are now waiting for an extradition request from the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. The arrest comes just hours before SBF was set to appear before Congress. Of course, that will no longer happen. The New York Times says the charges include wire fraud and bank fraud, which means SBF could be looking at life in prison. In November, FTX and its affiliates, roughly 130 companies, filed for bankruptcy after investors fled the cryptocurrency exchange on fears that FTX no longer had sufficient capital. In other words, it was the crypto equivalent of a bank run. Bankman-Fried has maintained that he did nothing illegal and simply screwed up, and some, including billionaire investor Bill Ackman, believed him, apparently tweeting, quote, "Call me crazy, but I think SBF is telling the truth." Clearly, the feds do not agree. Just a few months ago, SBF's personal wealth was estimated at $23 billion. FTX had assets valued at between $10 and $50 billion. Meantime, the other breaking news, a different Sam Brinton, is reportedly no longer working for the Department of Energy. Brinton was in charge of the DOE's effort to dispose of spent nuclear fuel and also gained notoriety for being the first high-ranking government official to be non-binary. Although police believe he's a thief, and is accused of stealing women's luggage at both the Minneapolis and Las Vegas airports. Tucker.
Bill Ackman fell for it. That's weird. He's a genius, I was told. Trace Gallagher, great to see you tonight.
You bet.
Stay tuned. Trace Gallagher, back midnight, Fox News at night. So back in 2013, a highly decorated Navy SEAL came out as transgender on CNN.
My female persona was hidden, and it was through so many different layers, and through so many purges, and through so many of those little disguises that I was able to just keep it totally pretty much turned off.
That man, Chris Beck, says it was all a horrifying, life-destroying mistake. He's detransitioning and speaking out tonight in hopes of protecting children from going through what he went through. Chris Beck joins us next. Closely than any reporter in the United States for the last 2 years. And today, in his estimation, the single largest caravan of illegal aliens flowing into this country in his 2 years of watching crossed today. He broke the story. He's got remarkable video for us. He's live at the border now. Bill, great to see you. What did you see?
Tucker, good evening to you. You mentioned it right off the top. This was easily the biggest group we have ever seen during our 19 months of covering this border crisis. And they all crossed illegally into El Paso last night. And we got some pretty wild camera footage to show you. Take a look at this. This was last night in El Paso, a massive caravan of over 1,000 illegal immigrants crossing into El Paso last night. Local media there reporting it was potentially up to 2,000 people and that it was possibly the biggest mass crossing in the city's history. Now, as you look at the video, you'll see just wave after wave after wave of these people walking across the river and then gathering on the U.S. side of the river where they kind of form a single file line. And you'll see that single file line starts stretching almost as far as the eye can see, as again well over 1,000 people crossed there. And it was cold there last night, so you'll see many of them started setting campfires in an effort to keep warm. And CBP sources tell Fox News that over the last 24 hours in that sector in El Paso, there have been more than 2,400 illegal crossings. Border Patrol there has more than 5,000 migrants in custody right now. They're completely overwhelmed, completely over capacity, so they've started mass releases of these people. They're just dropping hundreds of them off at a time in El Paso City streets. So the question here, where did all these people come from? We'll show you. They were bussed in with a Mexican police escort. Take a look at the second piece of video here. Fox News on scene in Ciudad Juarez as about 20 of these migrant buses filled with these migrants received a Mexican police escort into Ciudad Juarez, the city directly across from El Paso, and then they were all dropped off at local shelters and NGOs there in Juarez. But of course, they didn't stay at those shelters. They all started walking over to the river, walking to the border, and as you can see from the video, they started crossing in mass. Bizarre to see the Mexican government essentially escorting them there to have them cross just a few minutes later. And back out here live, Tucker, the numbers just exploding here at our southern border with the U.S. Border Patrol chief saying in the last 48 hours, there have been more than 16,000 illegal crossings, averaging out to 8,000 per day. Send it back to you.
Biggest crime of our lifetimes. Bill Mugin, thanks so much. Chris Beck is a name you may recognize. He's a highly decorated Navy SEAL. A decade ago, he became famous because he announced he was transitioning, becoming a woman, calling himself Kristen Beck. CNN made a film about him. And in that film, Chris Beck, at the time identifying as a woman, he admitted that he wasn't sure what the term transgender meant. Watch.
It's hard to explain. People ask me about that. They say, I don't really understand transgender, and, can you explain it to me? And the only thing I can tell them is, I don't really know what transgender is either. I don't know. I mean, I know what it is. It's this, but I don't know where it comes from or why.
So Chris Beck has had 10 years to think about this, and he looks back and believes and has said that the whole process of transitioning, quote, destroyed his life. In an interview with Robbie Starbuck, Beck said this, quote, everything that happened to me for the last 10 years destroyed my life. I destroyed my life. I'm not a victim. I did this to myself, but I had help. Chris Beck joins us now. Chris, thanks so much for coming on. It's a poignant story and deserves, I think, a much longer treatment than we're about to give it. But when you say you had help, what did you mean by that?
Well, the transgender originally started out as something, pretty basic and very rare. And now it's kind of morphed into an ideology. And that's what I'm kind of speaking out about. Speaking about the ideology, I'm not talking about the people. There's a lot of transgender people out there, great folks. But the ideology is what I'm talking about. It's becoming something where it's being pushed in schools and young teenagers are having surgeries because it's saying they're transgender. It's an affirmation. Once a teenager walks into an office, even if the parents are saying no, that doctor can override that, and that's a problem. So then you also, just to say the ideology and what's going on, to prove it is like what's happening to me. As soon as I started speaking out and saying that I think these teenagers need more time, they also need to reclassify transgender as gender dysphoria. It used to be in the psychologist manual for mental health issues. Now they've gotten rid of that, and now as soon as somebody goes in there and says anything even close to transgender, you're basically labeled transgender, and you start pushing your surgery. That's what I'm trying to stop. There's a lot of great people out there who are transgender and not transgender everything. What I'm talking about when I talk about CNN is that they take sound bites, they take something, and they talk about it one-sided. They talk about all the pros of transgender. Now I'm on Fox. Didn't want to do this. But now on Fox, I don't want it to happen the opposite way. What we need to do is take the politics out of this. We want to take the emotions out of this. And let's look at it as a medical team. Let's look at it through a lot of different scope. I don't want this to be political. And I don't want transgender people to be harmed. But if you're doing this to kids, that's wrong. I have a Navy SEAL friend of mine, a very good friend of mine. He has a daughter. The daughter was a tomboy. You could see it. She was a happy tomboy. She had double mastectomy at 16 years old. A Navy SEAL friend of mine. Now this person is 20, I think, and who knows what's going to happen. But they also start doing them on hormone blockers and all kinds of other hormone things, puberty blockers, everything else. It sterilizes these kids. So we're going to have all these children in 5 or 10 years who are being told one side of this story, and they're going, well, that's me, because they're not being told stories like mine. They're not being told stories like so many other people who have detransitions. They hide the fact that I even exist. They also say that I hate transgender people. I don't hate transgender people. There's a lot of my friends. What I care about is people. I want people to slow down. I want these doctors to see what they're doing. In psychology, take a look at gender dysphoria, take a look at autogynephilia, take a look at body dysmorphic disorder. There's a myriad of things you can look at, that we really have to start taking a look at. So what I'm telling is the medical industry and parents, you all need to wake up. You all need to know that there's a lot of information out there that's being hidden. And I want you to search for that information. If you're a teenager, look at the stories like Chloe Cole. She's 18 or 19 now, but I think she had a double mastectomy at like 14 or 15 years old. Look up that name, Chloe Cole. She's out here speaking about it because she's an adult now. So if she's getting all this done as a teenager, where does that put the medical industry? She was not a consenting adult, and she got life-altering surgeries. She got basically, castrated as a teenager with all these drugs and all the stuff they're giving them. Why? All I'm speaking out about is that. I want people to take a look at both sides. I want you to see the CNN side, and I want you to see the Fox side. Right now, this is not political. I don't want to be political. I don't want to be emotional. I don't want this to turn into something bigger than it is. This should not be news. If doctors would be honest and give the entire story, then I wouldn't even be on here right now. I would have gone about my life quietly. I would have been on my farm. You never would have heard from me. Tucker, I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to be on here. But we have to be here because nobody is standing up for these kids. Now, if there's a bunch of kids that are transgender and they grow up and they be happy and they're 80 years old and they're still happy, that's great. But there's a lot of kids that are getting caught up in this huge tidal wave of popular transgender culture, popular transgender ideology, and that is wrong. That's what I'm talking about.
What you've just expressed is the opposite of hate. It's measured and thoughtful and humane and born of your own experience and clearly motivated by good faith. And I hope it's seen by everyone because it's not political. You're absolutely right. Chris Beck, I appreciate your thinking that through and sharing with us what you've learned and what you hope for the country. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. So Joe Biden just signed a bill to help victims of sexual harassment. In none of the coverage did anybody in the media point out that Joe Biden himself has been very credibly accused with contemporaneous backup of violent sexual assault by a woman called Tara Reid, whose accusations we have reconsidered at great length and found them to be not just plausible, but almost certainly true. We're going to talk to her next. little better by signing the Speak Out Act into law. It's supposed to combat sexual harassment. But what you probably didn't read is that Joe Biden himself has been credibly accused of sexual misconduct, and not just by his own daughter, whom he showered with. In the presidential election of 2020, Tara Reid, a woman called Tara Reid, emerged to say that while working for Joe Biden in the U.S. Senate, he sexually assaulted her in a violent way. Most of the media buried the story. And we'll be honest and admit that we didn't know what to think of it. But we finally sat down and talked at great length with Tara Reid to hear what happened. And we were completely convinced that this is real and that she was able to prove it. The whole story is part of a brand new episode of Tucker Carlson Today, but here's part of it.
When Biden started acting weird towards me, he would like put his hands on my shoulder and put his fingers underneath my hair and do weird things like that. And then there was a scene where...
What did you think of that? I mean, did you...
Well, you know, bear in mind, and you were around and a professional in the 90s, it was a different... I don't know if you were in D.C., but it was a different vibe.
I was in D.C., yeah.
Okay, that was a different vibe, but it still was weird. I never had an employer do that, and Panetta certainly didn't act like that.
No, he's not like that.
No, not at all. And he's just all business. And, you know, Joe Biden was always, he didn't seem like an intellectual giant, let's put it that way.
Right. No, he was famously not.
Yeah.
But a charismatic and warm guy. That was the conventional view.
You know, and that's the thing. Behind closed doors, he was very temperamental.
Really?
And he would do this thing where he smiles when he's angry. It's very disconcerting. Very disconcerting, that big smile, and but he'd be angry, and he was very temperamental. He had me up against a wall, and he penetrated me with his fingers against my will. And I, you know, it wasn't just the assault though. It was everything to do with, here I am, this young staffer, and he did this, and then I made him angry. And that's like someone you don't want to make angry. Because I said no.
I just think it's, I've got to be honest, one of the reasons I didn't know what to make of your story was I've been a man for, 53 years.
Yeah.
I've never heard of anything like that. Like that's, men are kind of piggish, as we know, and they do piggish things. But that's like kind of like rape. I mean, that's like so out of bounds that it's weird to think someone would do something like that.
It was just... It happened all at once. It happened really quickly. There was no like flirtation with him or anything like that. It was very, he was usually with people and he wasn't. I was like at the wrong place, the wrong time, so to speak. And when it happened, he at first was like, "Come on, man, I heard you liked me." And I froze. And then he said he got angry, and that's when he smiled, that smile. And that's what was really jarring. And then he pointed his finger in my face and he said, "You're nothing. You're nothing to me." And then I must have had a certain look on my face, and he just took my shoulders and shook them. He said, "You're fine, you're fine, you're fine." And then he turned around and he walked away. And I remember it was just such a jarring, shocking incident. Probably was all of less than 5 minutes, right? But my vivid memory is sitting on these marble stairs, and my legs were shaking so badly because it wasn't just what he did, it's that I knew my career was over. That was it. Like, I had said no, it was an awful thing, and this was the end. He used his power and resources to silence me. And I'm going to share something with your audience. They took a cannonball to my life.
Yeah.
They went after my family. So when he did that assault, he took my future. I didn't want to sleep with some senator. I wanted to be one. And that day, it ended.
The cruelty she describes, not just an unwanted advance, not just the sexual violence, but the meanness to her from Joe Biden and from his staff and from people throughout the Democratic Party will just absolutely blow your mind. It's really offensive to anybody, not on partisan grounds. Just as a human being, you can't believe people would act that way, but they did. So we called the White House and we asked them for comment on what Tara Reid told us. Of course, they didn't respond. You can watch the whole interview tomorrow morning on Fox Nation. Also on Tucker Carlson today, we have a two-part conversation with Mike Tyson coming out Wednesday and Thursday. Maybe one of the greatest, most interesting interviews we've ever done, ever. Not one to miss. So Joe Biden's green energy push is, maybe not surprisingly, destroying the natural environment, including killing off an entire species of whale. Really? Ooh, save the Earth. Oh, but the whales are going extinct. Remember? Cared about the whales? Save the whales! They had those bumper stickers, and all like normal people kind of made fun of them. But you know, whales are kind of cool. Biggest mammal. You never thought that environmentalists would be killing off an entire species of whale. Oh, but they are. And the administration is leading the charge. Rosie Moore is a geoscientist who joins us tonight to explain. Rosie, thanks so much for coming on. How are the whales, how is the species of whale being killed?
Hi, thanks for having me. Yeah, so the right whale species right now are in a very precarious situation. 10 years ago, we were seeing numbers around 500, and today it's dwindled down to about 350 known individuals in the wild. So with this proposed energy plan, they're proposing a sizable amount of wind turbines to be installed off the coast of New England. And this is going to cause potentially the demise of the right whales in that area. What we're going to see is a large amount of vessel traffic going through the area, and vessel strikes are the #1 killer of right whales in the wild. In addition to that, during the construction and the decommission of these wind turbines, you're going to see a large amount of noise in the area, and that's going to really mess with their ability to communicate and feed in that area as well. So it's going to be rough on them.
So, in other words, to save the Earth, we're destroying a species of whale. I mean, there seems like there's an irony there, right? That doesn't seem like environmentalism to me.
Right. Well, it's a hard trade-off. Obviously, we need a renewable energy source, but not at the expense of a critically endangered animal.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you're being criticized or not for coming on the show and saying it, but we're for animals, so I'm glad that you did. Rosie Moore, thanks.
Thanks.
So, obviously, the COVID shot, no one wants to rub it in since pretty much everyone got it, but it didn't work very well. And in fact, they can be harmful. And in fact, the majority of people dying of COVID now are vaccinated. So it is a pandemic of the vaccinated. And yet, a lot of places, a lot of big institutions are still requiring that you get these shots, even though they don't work and they're dangerous. So Matthew Martson is an actor and just lost a job and maybe a career because he refused to get the shot. He's appeared in films like The Transformers, Rambo. He was blocked from taking an acting role because he refused to get an ineffective, potentially harmful vaccine. Matthew Martson joins us tonight. Thank you so much for coming on. Tell us when this happened. I mean, if this had happened like a year and a half ago, but is this recent?
Yeah, I think that's why it's so ridiculous. I mean, we all know about the effectiveness or the non-effectiveness of the COVID jab at this point. This was a few weeks ago. I got offered a job, which I was very happy about, obviously. It's always good to work when you're an actor. Yes. And they said that there was still a requirement that you had to be vaccinated on set. I informed them that I was not vaccinated, and I submitted a religious exemption, which, you know, you can imagine how that goes down in Hollywood. It was, of course, dismissed, and that's that. I mean, I'm not surprised, to be honest with you, because this has been happening for some time. What I am surprised about, Tucker, is that this ridiculous kabuki theatre is continuing on, and no one's actually stepping up and saying, this has to end, it's ridiculous. It's completely anti-science. It's not logical. And I have no idea why they're still pursuing these policies, because, you know, if you can be infected as someone who is unvaccinated, you can just as much be infected as we know if you are vaccinated. So the argument that going on set and getting everyone, sick on set is just a moot point at this moment.
So there are a lot of people in Los Angeles working with fake vax cards. I know this for a fact. I know that you know it too. You could have done that, as many have done, but you decided not to. Why?
I didn't become a citizen of this country to have my First Amendment rights and my other rights and things that great Americans have fought for and died for me to have to worry about having to lie about something like having a vaccine. I think it's an invasion of privacy. I don't think it's right. And, you know, we're not exactly storming the beaches here, Tucker. You know, it's just standing up for what you believe is right. And I believe that if more people did it, then they'd have nowhere to go. Then these things would stop, and they'd start changing their policies. There has to be a point where people say enough, And because where does it stop? I mean, we all saw that in the lockdowns. Where does it stop? Does it stop, you know, with the masks? Does it stop with locking people in their houses? And now, to me, I think it's just unbelievable that they were saying that you have to inject your body with something that is invasive. I cannot believe in the United States of America that this would happen. It's not the country that I grew up loving and believing in.
Yes. Well, you know, despite the hardship it has caused you, I'm so impressed by the decision that you made, the one on principle, and I just hope the best for you. Matthew Martson, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. In the summer of 2020, mobs of Joe Biden voters destroyed big parts of the city of Minneapolis. They looted stores, they burned a police station, they murdered people. But they did this, we were informed at the time, in the name of something called racial justice. But then we saw that some of the mob turned out to be privileged white kids, the children of lawyers from Bethesda. But they said they were rioting on behalf of so-called marginalized communities. They were working for racial justice. And because of that, they couldn't be punished for what they did. Nor, by the way, were they required to wear COVID masks like the rest of us. That's how holy their mission was. They're exempt from the normal laws of civilization. Kamala Harris raised money for them like they were missionaries. You probably remember that. But do you recall what happened next in Minneapolis? That's the part of the story the media had no interest in covering, and they never do. The iron law of liberal social activism is that you never revisit the scenes of your moral victories. You give a speech declaring yourself a good person and you go home. You don't return to Selma or Soweto or Ferguson, Missouri to see how the people there are doing, because it's not about those people. It's about you and your newly enhanced moral authority, which is instantly convertible to political power and cash. Ask Barack Obama. But in the spring of 2021, one reporter decided to break with protocol and go back to Minneapolis a year later. He wanted to see what racial justice had done for the city. His name was Michael Tracy, and as you can imagine, he writes for Substack, not the New York Times. One night, while Tracy was in Minneapolis, a man walked into a Somali-owned convenience store and murdered the clerk. Tracy wanted to know why that happened, so he started to interview people in the neighborhood. And one of them told him this, quote, African Americans are hunting Somalis in Minneapolis. Why is that? Well, because, quote, they believe Somalis are getting special favors from the government. Are you surprised to hear that? You should not be surprised. Because when government creates a spoils system based on race and ethnicity, and our government certainly has done that, division and violence are the inevitable outcomes. That is true always and everywhere. That fact never changes. And liberals for many decades used to pretend to understand that. That's why they opposed Jim Crow and the Nuremberg laws. But at some point, and it would be interesting to know precisely when and why, liberals enthusiastically embraced the racial spoils system they once claimed to hate. This is unfolding across the country, but it's especially prevalent in places liberals control. The more power liberals have, the more sweeping and rigid the race-based spoils system they create. In California, of course, they have absolute power, and that's why the governor of San Francisco has just announced they will send you money if you have the right skin color.
Families will get $1,000 a month for 2 years with no strings attached.
The most vulnerable people in the community, if you're the most vulnerable person in the community, you get $1,000 a month. But that specifically does not include the homeless guy ODing in the park on fentanyl if he's white. If he's white, he can die because if he's white, even if he's dying, he's by definition not vulnerable. California now has many programs like this. The state has now proposed a reparations program for the descendants of slaves. It seems simple, but there's a problem with it. How do you know who qualifies for reparations? It's been a long time. It's been more than 150 years since slavery. And Americans have made a lot of babies since then. And many of them are interracial. So at this point, there are plenty of white people in America who are descended from slaves. There are plenty of black people in America who are descended from slave owners. That's just true. So how do you know who qualifies for government reparations? Well, of course, there's only one way to find out, and it's old-fashioned Nazi race science. Nazi race science. So the state will have to certify the racial purity of its citizens in order to send them money. That's going to have to happen. Do we really want to go there? Do we really want to do that? Amazingly, liberals really do. The city of San Francisco just fired its elections director, a man called John Arnst, because he is white. We're not guessing at that. The president of San Francisco's election commission, Chris Jordanek, confirmed that was the reasoning. And we're quoting, "Our decision," he said to the man who was fired, "was not about your performance. But after 20 years, we wanted to take action on the city's racial equity plan and give people an opportunity to compete for a leadership position." Fired for his skin color. Aren't we against that? Didn't we have a civil rights movement to stop that? And by the way, in this specific case, the guy who got fired, John Arnst, single-handedly ended widespread corruption and incompetence in San Francisco's election. He had the job for 2 decades. They used to have ballot boxes turning up regularly in the San Francisco Bay. That was fraud. He stopped it. But his skin color was the problem. The shade of his skin was more offensive to liberals in San Francisco than fraudulent elections. Now, there was an outcry over this, and Arnst ultimately got his job back. But the city of San Francisco, the government, not just the people, the government, still endorses the idea of punishing people based on their skin color. The city of San Francisco just launched a separate guaranteed income program, this one for, quote, pregnant black women. It pays up to $1,000 a month. And that program got more than $5 million more in state funding, so it's expanding now to Los Angeles, Riverside, Contra Costa County, Alameda. The left-wing group Expecting Justice Just put together this promo for the program. Watch. So that is, every word of it, a racist lie. There's precisely no evidence that structural racism exists in this country against the community she's talking about, and none whatsoever that it causes higher infant mortality. There's no science whatsoever. That's just, again, a racist lie. But more to the point, nobody who says birthing people should ever be in charge of handing out money to mothers, much less taxpayers' money. But of course that's happening, and that tells you, well, this is a grift. This is a scam designed to shunt money from people who make it to people who vote for the right party. And that's why Sheila Jackson Lee recently demanded billions of dollars of reparations, because that, she said, would have been a much better way to deal with COVID.
Interestingly, a recent peer-reviewed study from Harvard Medical School suggests that reparations for African Americans could have cut COVID-19 transmission and infection rates both among blacks and the population at large.
So she's obviously a fringe character and easy to make fun of. But it wasn't just Sheila Jackson Lee. That was the official position. That was the prevailing view of the Democratic Party in 2020. Vote for us and we'll give reparations based on skin color.
Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee has proposed a bill to form a commission to study how to do reparations.
When I am elected president, I will sign it.
Would you sign that bill? Yes. Yes, would you sign it? The House and Senate passed that bill, of course I would sign it.
I firmly support Congresswoman Jackson Lee's bill to create a commission to study reparations.
Would you sign the bill for reparations?
Yes, I would. I already support that bill.
There are things that we need to do in this country that have been a long time in coming. One of those is to move forward with reparations.
So again, it's hard to overstate just how crazy and divisive that is. In order for that to work in practice, you would have to take people's blood and figure out what percentage they were of one race or the other, maybe measure their heads. You would wind up with Nazi race science, with racial purity tests. And no decent person wants to live in a country where the government does that. It's obviously a dead end and a terrible idea. And it would, of course, promote violence and division. So that's a non-starter when you think about it. But Joe Biden decided he was going to get around a national debate on reparations simply by just doing it, throwing it in the Farm Bill. Biden, right after he took office, allocated billions of dollars in farm aid based on race, just on race. A judge, thankfully, shut that down. But they didn't slow down in their effort to create a racial spoil system. They don't care about what it does to the country. So Kamala Harris suggested that certain communities, based on their skin color, deserve faster hurricane response. So there's an entire civil rights department at the Justice Department a division designed to stop the government from rewarding or punishing people on the basis of skin color. That was the whole point of the civil rights movement. But they're doing nothing. Of course, they're encouraging it because Democrats run the government. So as a result, California just launched yet another basic income program, this time for trans people. Really, how's that going to work? How do you prove you're trans? Can anyone even define what that means? No. But here's San Francisco Supervisor Raphael Mandelman bragging about how much taxpayer money London Breed gives to people for being trans.
Every single year, this at unhoused trans folks.
The most vulnerable people. Really, how are we measuring vulnerability? When The View supports and celebrates your existence every single day, when every fashionable person in America posts tributes to you on social media every week, how vulnerable are you? But let's get right to it. Let's measure that by household income. Is the household income of the average trans person in America higher or lower than it is on, say, an Indian reservation? Is it higher or lower than it is in, say, rural Iowa? And by the way, what is transgender? On the current application in San Francisco, there are 97 different gender options available, 19 sexual orientations. These would include aromantic, demisexual, dyke, pansexual, same-gender loving, and scoliosexual. So at this point, probably not going to get California back into the realm of functional and sane. 20 years from now, that will be a deeply poor state presided over by a small group of incredibly rich people. Every normal person of all colors will have left and moved to Florida. Probably no fixing it at this point. They'll be cutting the redwood forests, selling them for money. You know exactly where this is going. Look at Bolivia. But what can the rest of us in the other 49 states learn from what's happening in California? Victor Davis Hanson has spent his life there. His family's been there for generations. He's with the Hoover Institute. We're happy to have him join us now. Professor, thanks so much for coming on. It seems to me that once you go down this path where government decides certain races or certain orientations are better than others, like, how do you fix that?
I don't think you do. You're like the former Yugoslavia. And financially, once something is not sustainable, it's not sustainable. What you outlined, Tucker, was predicated on three things. One was Silicon Valley's big money infusions, and now they're laying off people, and companies are fleeing because of the regulatory atmosphere. 45% of the population is Latino. Many of them are upwardly mobile. They're not allies in some rainbow coalition with the 5% who are African American. They're against reparations, and many of them are starting to become more conservative. And the so-called white middle class and upper middle class entrepreneurial class is leaving at the rate of 300,000 a year. And that's why we have the highest taxes, income, among the highest sales, the highest gas taxes, and yet we're having a $25 billion shortfall of these types of programs. So it's not sustainable, and I don't know how you stop it. There's no way I can foresee stopping it, because this is just the veneer. I mean, we rate in the bottom 10% of schools. We have the highest property crime rates in the country in San Francisco. We have 1/3 of the nation's welfare recipients, 40% of the homeless, 21% living below the poverty level, and we have about 40% of the illegal aliens in the nation. So it's all been a gravy train fed by Silicon Valley money and upper middle class 1% paying 50% of the income tax, and it's coming to a close. They're running out of money.
I mean, I wonder if they know that. I mean, you'd hate to see them get to a point where they have to sell the state's natural resources to keep going. They have to, sell Lake Tahoe to Arizona. But it seems like they're on an express train to that place. Does anybody in leadership understand this?
No, I think they'd rather be ideologically correct and broke than be prosperous and incorrect, because we're sitting on some of the largest gas and oil deposits of the 50 states. We have the richest agricultural sector in the world. We have enormous resources in timber and mining. We're not using any of it. That's all off limits. And we're trying to destroy the agricultural sector by cutting off the water. We haven't reinvested in this once wonderful infrastructure of aqueducts, lakes, freeways. We've got this high-speed rail, $15 billion boondoggle. It looks like Stonehenge, covered with graffiti, unfinished. They don't want to do what would save them, and they're going over the cliff like lemmings.
Yeah, and I wish you were wrong, but you would know, and I think you're right. Victor Davis Hanson.
I wish I was
thank
too.
You.
It's tragic.
I know.
Thank you.
I know. It is tragic. Great to see you tonight. Lost her bid to become the next Arizona governor by just over 17,000 votes. That's a tiny margin in a big state. Now Lake is suing the state's election officials. She says many ballots were not properly counted. She also says her opponent, then Secretary of State Katie Hobbs, worked illegally with big tech to silence voters online. And for the record, that appears to be true. Lake is also citing widespread printer failures in Maricopa County, also true. She says they prevented people from voting. Maricopa County claimed they didn't stop anyone from voting, but has not responded further. We reached out to Katie Hobbs' office and got no reply at all. Carrie Lake joins us tonight. Carrie Lake, thanks so much for coming on. So Maricopa County, as far as I understand it, does not deny that a huge number of printers didn't work on Election Day, but they're saying it had no effect?
Well, and it had a huge effect, obviously, Tucker. Our voters were showing up on Election Day. That was no secret. And the minute the polls opened, the wheels fell off. The ballot printers weren't working. There wasn't enough toner in the printers. The tabulators weren't working. It became a debacle. And the lines started forming right away. Some of the lines 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours. And there's video of people walking out of line. People told us, and this is in our lawsuit, that they showed up, they couldn't even find parking because the parking lots were full and the lines were long, and many people didn't even get to vote. And those who did vote, when they went up to get the printer out, the printer didn't have toner in it, so the ballots weren't dark enough. And our voters were showing up and voting 3-1 for me on Election Day. We vote for a full month in Arizona with early ballots, and on Election Day, when the Republicans showed up, the Election Day voting was sabotaged, and that's what our case is going to prove. It's a 70-page lawsuit that reads like a real crime novel, and it's shocking what they did. The man who runs Maricopa County elections ran a PAC. He actually started a PAC raising thousands of dollars to defeat me, and he's running our elections. And then my opponent oversees all the elections in Arizona. It was a conflict of interest, and not only was Katie Hobbs working with big tech to censor people, the man who runs Maricopa County elections, they were also censoring people as well online.
I don't think anyone denies that a lot of the voting machinery didn't work on Election Day. I mean, I don't think that's a controversial point that you're making. It's an observation. But weren't they tested all the day before?
They are supposed to be tested, but they weren't tested. They weren't tested in the appropriate way. And they didn't have the basics like toner in these machines. I mean, this is real basic stuff. It's not like we don't know when Election Day is. We can figure out when Election Day is from here to eternity. And they were not prepared. And we will have an expert testifying that this could not have happened by accident. There had to be malicious intent. We have an excellent court case, and we had our first hearing yesterday and set up a time for our trial to begin. And it will be next Tuesday, and we will be presenting a lot of evidence. We have 4 whistleblowers, one that worked for a company called Runbeck, who said there were 300,000 ballots inserted into the system that had no chain of custody. Others who were in the voter signature verification department said tens of thousands of ballots were rejected because there were no signatures or scribbles, and they somehow got thrown in and counted anyways. There are a plethora of problems that went down in Maricopa County, and if somebody doesn't stand up and say we can't have our elections being run this way, then we'll never have another fair election. I mean, 60% of the polling places on Election Day were inoperational or non-functioning. When do we stop and say enough is enough? Would it have to get to 80%, 90%, 100%? When do we say we need to have our elections run fair?
I completely agree with you. And if you care about democracy, this would be the top of your list. I'm glad you're doing this. Carrie Lake, thank you for telling us about it tonight. Good to see you.
Thanks, Tucker.
So Atlanta isn't just any other city. It is what New York is to the Northeast, and Los Angeles is to the West, and Chicago is to the Midwest, and Denver is to the Mountain States. It's the hub of an entire region. And it's a nice place. So if Atlanta starts to fall apart, you should care. The murder rate in that city is up 78% in just the last month. One of the victims was an elderly woman who was stabbed to death in a gated community during an attempted carjacking. Here's a local news report from Fox 5 in Atlanta.
Family and friends of 77-year-old Ellen Bowles say she had a kind heart and a love for all living things. This man, who they call a person of interest, seen on a neighbor's security video.
We are really sad, and we're particularly concerned about Michael, you know, her son who found her.
Michael Bowles discovered his mom's body stabbed to death in her own garage in this gated community on Paces West Terrace over the weekend. Her car, a black 2021 Lexus SUV, was gone.
So a lot of these crimes are taking place in the neighborhood that pays a lot of the taxes in Atlanta, the northern part of the city. It's called Buckhead. Buckhead has been thinking about leaving Atlanta for quite some time. It's now announced plans to do that. But the state's Lieutenant Governor, Jeff Duncan, paused the Buckhead City referendum bill to give the mayor time to fix the crime problem. Has the mayor fixed the crime problem? Apparently not. Bill White is the chairman and CEO of Buckhead City, Georgia. He joins us tonight. Mr. White, thanks so much for coming on. So they said they were going to make it better. It doesn't sound like they have made it better for the people of Buckhead.
No, sir. Thank you, Tucker, for having us on. Our heart goes out to Eleanor Bowles' family. And just about 3 weeks prior to that, Chris Eberhard, a contractor, was brutally murdered. Both assailants were in the progress of robbing or committing crimes. One was being chased by APD, the Atlanta Police Department. The other was being chased by the liquor store owner. Called the police. The police didn't show up to pick him up. He went over a wall and stabbed beautiful Eleanor Bowles to death. The other man got in a car accident after APD didn't chase him, and he went off and shot Chris Eberhard, a 57-year-old contractor, and stole his car as well. Listen, crime is not down in Buckhead, and the mayor keeps coming into Atlanta, and he says, when there's a murder in Buckhead, hey, Buckhead, crime is down. You know, sit down, shut up, pay your taxes. And I'm telling you, the people of Buckhead have had it. Atlanta can no longer protect us, Tucker, so we have no choice here. It's our only choice to stand up for ourselves and fight back. You know, the DA, Fani Willis, who's busy prosecuting someone we all know for a phone call with 18 lawyers, didn't prosecute these two folks who killed both of those people. And they should have been in jail, not being out to be able to kill these two beautiful souls. So we're fighting to get this bill passed. And we have a new lieutenant governor, Burt Jones. We have a newly elected governor, Brian Kemp, a new speaker, John Burns. And we're hoping that the bill will pass so we can vote next November 7th and make Buckhead safe, secure, and independent in very short order.
You do not have a moral obligation to pay for the corruption and violence of the city of Atlanta, which hates you. You don't. And I think it'll be an inspiration to the entire country if you're able to pull this off and be your own city. Independence. There's nothing wrong with that. It's American. Bill White, Godspeed. We are really rooting for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tucker. God bless you, sir.
Biden's non-binary, dress-wearing, kleptomaniacal, underwear-stealing nuclear waste official, Sam Brinton. Now, you may recall, how could you forget, that Brinton was busted stealing ladies' luggage from 2 different airports and subsequently let go for his weirdest fetish of all. Now we want to bring you Sam Brinton's mugshot. You can see it on your screen. He looks a little different without the lipstick, a little more menacing. Put the lipstick back on, Sam Brinton. You're freaking us out. So TikTok turns out to be by far, didn't know this actually, the most popular social media app in the United States. But the problem is it's owned by a Chinese company controlled by the Chinese government. And it is for that reason a major security risk. Not only does it disseminate propaganda, it hurts the country, it also apparently is used for spying. So the governments of a couple of states have already moved to block TikTok on government devices. Now a U.S. Senator from Florida, Senator Marco Rubio, has introduced legislation to ban TikTok. Senator Rubio joins us tonight. Senator, thanks so much for coming on. So Republicans, conservatives are generally against banning private companies. Tell us why we should ban TikTok, if you would.
Well, what we ban is their ability to make money in the country, and the reason is because it's basically a wholly owned subsidiary of the Communist Party of China. You know, one thing, it's not about the content, ultimately. I mean, we have free speech in this country. It's about how the data that's on it is being used. So that's number one. Some people would say to me, well, what do we care if the Chinese government has access to the data on the phone of a 16-year-old teenager somewhere in America? It's not about the 16-year-old teenager. It's about millions of 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 30-year-olds, people that are on there dumping all kinds of data that the government of China gets access to on location, your pictures, your text, your consumer behavior, what the algorithm is learning from you. And then the other thing is, and this is what's really stunning to me, the Chinese tried to interfere in our midterm elections. They were putting out videos discouraging people, and they were using the algorithms to do this, discouraging people from voting on a bipartisan basis or nonpartisan basis. And that's why I tell people, if TikTok was a Russian company, there would be an FBI raid of their headquarters. At least they would be calling for it on the left. So I think everyone agrees they're a privacy danger to America, to our national security. We shouldn't have the Communist Party of China having access to a treasure trove of American data that they can use to try to influence and divide us at the same time as they collect valuable information now and for the future.
Well, yeah, we banned RT. I'm hoping that you're going to get at least one Democrat on your side on this, are you?
I think we will. Look, I think we have a lot of Democrat support for the concern about it. You know, Mark Warner is the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. Him and I sent a letter together asking the Justice Department and the intelligence agencies to speed up this review. But I don't think anything's going to come of it. I really don't. I don't think at the end of the day that anything's going to come of this security review or that anything they do will take care of this problem. I think we have to begin with a very basic principle. Companies under the control of the Chinese Communist Party should not have access, unfettered access, to the private data of millions and millions of Americans that they can then use against us for espionage, for foreign policy, for division.
Thank you for saying that. And it's so crisply and nicely put. I hope you'll keep saying it. Senator Marco Rubio, Florida, good to see you.
Thanks, Tucker. Thanks.
So we're going to be issuing a very important and honestly heartfelt correction on our Mayor Pete private jet coverage. Turns out we were wrong, and we'll tell you how. Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. So not long after Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald on camera in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters, a lot of Americans started to have some questions about the Kennedy assassination. It was, you'd have to admit, a pretty extraordinary sequence of events. A lone gunman murders the President of the United States, and then, less than 48 hours later, that lone gunman is himself murdered by another lone gunman. What are the odds of that? It's one thing if you get struck by lightning, rare but possible. But if every member of your family also gets struck by lightning all on different days, you might begin to suspect these are not entirely natural events. But oh, replied the U.S. government, they are. This bizarre chain of killings was all entirely natural. So less than a year after the JFK assassination, the Johnson White House released something called the Warren Commission report. And the report concluded that while their motives remained unclear, both Lee Oswald and Jack Ruby had acted alone. No one helped them. There was no conspiracy of any kind. Case closed. Time to move on. And many Americans did move on. At the time, they had no idea how shoddy and corrupt the Warren Commission was. It would be nearly 50 years before the CIA admitted under duress that, in fact, it had withheld information from investigators about its relationship with Lee Harvey Oswald. But even then, at the time, before that was known, the government's explanation didn't seem entirely plausible, and some people started asking obvious questions about it. It was at that point, as Americans started to doubt the official story, that the term conspiracy theory entered our lexicon. As Professor Lance DeHaven Smith points out in his book on the subject, the term conspiracy theory did not exist as a phrase in everyday American conversation before 1964. In 1964, the year the Warren Commission issued its report, the New York Times published 5 stories in which conspiracy theory appeared. Now today, of course, the term conspiracy theory appears in pretty much every New York Times story about American politics. It's wielded, now as then, as a weapon against anyone who asks questions the government doesn't feel like answering. But despite 60 years of name-calling, those questions have not disappeared. In fact, they have multiplied with time. And here's one of them. In April of 1964, a psychiatrist called Louis Joylan West visited Jack Ruby in his isolation cell in a Dallas jail. According to West's written assessment, he found that Jack Ruby was, quote, technically insane and in need of immediate psychiatric hospitalization. Those are conclusions that, puzzlingly, no one who had spoken to Jack Ruby previously had reached. Ruby had seemed perfectly sane to the people who knew him. Louis Joylan West pronounced him crazy. But what West did not say was that he was working for the CIA at the time. Louis Joyland West was a contract psychiatrist for the spy agency. He was also an expert on mind control and a prominent player in the now infamous MK-Ultra program, in which the CIA gave powerful psychiatric drugs to Americans without their knowledge. So of all the psychiatrists in the world, what in the world was this guy doing in Jack Ruby's prison cell? The media did not seem interested in finding out. In fact, the New York Times, in an extensive 1999 obituary of West, never mentioned the fact that he had worked for the CIA, much less his time in Jack Ruby's cell, which seems relevant. So you can see why non-crazy people would wonder about what really happened, and of course many have wondered. In 1976, long forgotten, the House of Representatives impaneled a special committee to reinvestigate the JFK assassination. Their bipartisan conclusion? Jack Kennedy was almost certainly murdered as the result of a conspiracy. But the question is, a conspiracy by whom? Well, the obvious suspect would be the CIA. Why else would the agency withhold critical evidence from investigators? Is there a benign explanation for that, for maintaining this level of secrecy for this many years? Not that we're aware of. And it is illegal. In 1992, Congress passed the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. And that act mandated full disclosure of all documents by 2017, 54 years after JFK was killed. The last administration promised to comply fully with that law, but under intense pressure from CIA Director Mike Pompeo, withheld in the end thousands of pages of CIA documents. Today, this afternoon, the Biden administration did exactly the same thing. That would be thousands of pages of documents after nearly 60 years, after the death of every single person involved. But we still can't see them. Clearly, it's not to protect any person. They're all dead. It's to protect an institution. But why? Well, today we decided to find out. We spoke to someone who had access to these still hidden CIA documents, a person who was deeply familiar with what they contain. We asked this person directly, did the CIA have a hand in the murder of John F. Kennedy, an American president? And here's the reply we received verbatim. Quote, "The answer is yes. I believe they were involved. It's a whole different country from what we thought it was. It's all fake." It's hard to imagine a more jarring response than that. Again, this is not a, quote, conspiracy theorist that we spoke to. Not even close. This is someone with direct knowledge of the information that once again is being withheld from the American public. And the answer we received was unequivocal. Yes, the CIA was involved in the assassination of the president. Now, some people will not be surprised to hear that. They suspected it all along. But no matter how you feel about or what you thought about the Kennedy assassination, pause to consider what this means. It means that within the U.S. government, there are forces wholly beyond democratic control. These forces are more powerful than the elected officials that supposedly oversee them. These forces can affect election outcomes. They can even hide their complicity in the murder of an American president. In other words, they can do pretty much anything they want. They constitute a government within a government, mocking by their very existence the idea of democracy. As cynical as we have become after 30 years of watching government officials ignore the voters who employ them, we were shocked to learn this. It's not acceptable. Americans have trusted their government less with every passing year since the killing of John F. Kennedy. Maybe this is why. And people have known this for a long time. The people who knew would include every director of the CIA since November of 1963. And that list would include Obama's CIA director, John Brennan, one of the most sinister and dishonest figures in American life. That list would also include, we are sad to say, our friend Mike Pompeo, who ran the CIA in the last administration. Mike Pompeo knew this. We asked Pompeo to join us tonight, and though he rarely turns down a televised interview, he refused to come. We hope he will reconsider. In the meantime, we are happy to be joined tonight by New York Post columnist Miranda Devine. Miranda, thank you so much for coming on. I don't think we've paused long enough to consider what this means. After 60 years, when every person involved is dead, we can't see classified information about maybe the pivotal event in modern American history. And now we know why.
Well, Tucker, look, you laid it out really well. And, you know, it used to be that conservatives like me dismissed theories from the left about JFK's assassination as just left-wing conspiracy theories. But over time, I think that the left looks as if they were quite justified in not trusting the intelligence services. And I think the WMD pretext for the Iraq war was a red pill, a slowly dawning red pill for me. And so now you just have to look just on a really basic level. You just look at the fact that 30 years ago, Congress, in a unanimous, bipartisan, unequivocal, unambiguous decision, said that all the JFK files have to be made public. Absolutely no reason to keep them back. As you say, it's almost 60 years ago. Everybody involved is dead. You're not worried about sullying reputations or unmasking a spy overseas. No, there can only be two reasons for it. One is that you're trying to protect the CIA against allegations or revelations that it knew more than it made out about Lee Harvey Oswald. It had a huge file on him. They were investigating him or in contact with him before the assassination, and they didn't do enough to save JFK or protect the president. But you know, is that enough to really keep this secret going for 60 years? I mean, the terrible dawning recognition is that really this is about, as you said, protecting the institution. If the CIA was involved in that assassination, that is the reason that you would want to keep that from the American people, because the fury that would erupt, and this is a bipartisan fury, it'd be the one thing that would unite Americans, is an absolute rage at this unaccountable spy agency that has decided that it is going to get involved in murdering, assassinating the duly elected American president. For what reason? You know, there would be such a clean out of the CIA. I don't know if it would even survive. And so the trust in our institutions is already at rock bottom. I think it's a mistake for Mike Pompeo not to come on your show, because all this does is fuel more conspiracy theories. The truth is the best disinfectant, and if the CIA did do this, was involved 60 years ago, then it needs to come clean. We need to have a reckoning.
And just to be clear, that was the assessment of someone we spoke to who was directly and personally familiar with the contents of these documents, not someone who read it on the internet. This is someone who had access to the documents. And I have to say, I don't understand, and I agree with you, secrecy abets evil. And the more secrecy you have, the more evil you're likely to have. So we should minimize the amount of secrecy as a general matter. But I don't understand how John Brennan can go on NBC News every day, he was on today, and no one pauses and asks, like, what is this exactly? 60 years, really? And don't give me the sources and methods BS, by the way, son. Like, we're adults here. What's the real reason? Why does no one ask him that?
Well, the more we see characters from the CIA, like John Brennan, like those 51 former intelligence officials who signed that scurrilous letter about Hunter Biden being Russian disinformation, the less impressive they look. These people are in the shadows for a reason, because if you actually saw who they were, look at John Brennan. Would you, knowing what we know now about him, would you really entrust him to run the country's premier spy agency, to have such power to run around the world intervening in other countries' elections? No. So I just don't know what good it does us to have those kind of malevolent people having so much power and using it in our name and causing us all great harm because we don't know what they're doing.
That's right. Transparency can fix it. It's the only thing that can. And I appreciate your assessment tonight. Marina Devine of the New York Post, thank you.
Thanks, Tucker.
So the same people who are withholding this information, lying to us about the pivot point in modern American history, sitting on the fact that a U.S. agency is complicit in the murder of an American president, those same people are now overseeing U.S. involvement in the war in Ukraine, Americans fighting Russia. And that involvement is escalating significantly. According to multiple reports tonight, the Biden administration is preparing to send Patriot missile defense systems to Ukraine. Now, These are not surface-to-air missiles. These are long-range missile defense systems that can shoot down both missiles and aircraft. They are more advanced than any weapon this country has sent so far to Ukraine. That's saying a lot. As recently as March, the Pentagon denied that it would ever do anything like this. A senior U.S. defense official said in March that, quote, there is no discussion about putting a Patriot battery in Ukraine. In order to do that, you would have to put U.S. troops with it to operate it. In other words, you would have American troops directly fighting Russia. Congress has not authorized that. The American public is not in favor of that. There's no justification for that. And of course, the risks of doing that are profound. But now we are. Positioning troops in Ukraine is no longer a problem. It's no longer a theoretical problem. It's a reality. And Democrats in Congress are encouraging it. Watch.
We can provide them air defense systems, specifically Patriot missiles, and we've got to accelerate delivery of those.
I have called on the United States to really prioritize Ukraine. I've suggested that we should take Patriot missiles, but also another system called the AMRAAM system.
How worried are you that supplying these Patriot systems could lead to a very serious escalation in this war that would involve the U.S. and Russia now directly fighting?
I'm not that worried, Aaron.
I'm not that worried. He's not that worried because it's already happening. So U.S. military personnel are fighting Russia right now. That's a fact. But what's Russia's response? How close are we to something awful? Most Americans don't know because news from Russia has been cut off completely here. You're not allowed to know. It's been censored, as it is in North Korea. But you should know that the Russian Foreign Ministry has warned that there'll be, quote, consequences if the Biden administration puts Patriot missiles and U.S. personnel in Ukraine. Is that Russian propaganda? No, it's just what they said. So in order to underscore the point, the Russian government has just released footage of the Yars nuclear missile. That missile is capable of hitting both the United States and the UK. You're seeing footage of it right now. It shows a Russian Yars rocket being installed into a silo south of Moscow. A Russian general told state media that the plan is to hit London. Quote, you don't have to hit Washington first, it's too far away. London is next door. London is the main hotbed of all nastiness. So, however you feel about Ukraine, you can oppose the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Most people do. We do. This is very serious. And you'd think that lawmakers in Congress would notice it was happening, but they don't seem to care. As Adam Schiff said the other day, Armageddon is a small price to pay because we need to defend, quote, democracy in Ukraine.
Do you think the risk of direct conflict is growing?
I think it is growing. I think it is manageable, and I think the Biden administration has done a remarkable job in managing that and not letting it get out of hand. But you see Putin continue to rattle the nuclear saber, which is extremely dangerous. It can't deter us, though, from giving our full and complete support to Ukraine.
So how do we get to a place where Adam Schiff, who is demonstrably dishonest and reckless, almost demented, in the way he behaves, is playing a significant role in U.S. foreign policy? It's scary. Pretty much everything they have told us about this war since the very beginning has been a lie. And again, most people don't know because our news is so controlled by the U.S. government, one of the things we've learned from the Twitter files. But very quickly, let's run through some of the things they've told us. They told us that sanctions were going to cripple the Russian economy. Joe Biden said that in a speech to the country. Did it? Well, this summer, the Russian ruble hit its strongest level in 7 years. And just a few months ago, Russia posted a massive trade surplus. Russian propaganda? No, economic facts. Our policy isn't working. In fact, it's counterproductive. From January to September of this year, Russia's trade surplus was $120 billion higher than it was in the same period last year. It's double Russia's previous record set in 2008. That's what our sanctions have done. Remember when we were told that Putin would be crippled by sanctions? Liars. A Rebel News reporter called Jeremy Lafredo just went to Moscow to see what is happening there. Turns out they're doing okay. What we're doing isn't hurting them, only us. Grocery stores in Moscow are not empty, they're not running out of food, and their food prices aren't bad either. Watch this. So there's no question that we will be accused of Russian propaganda for playing that clip, not that we care. But it gives us the chance to make a very obvious point. That's news. Those are facts. We are bringing you information. You do with it what you will. That's not propaganda. Propaganda is when you withhold information from the population in order to affect a policy they don't actually support. That's what North Korea does. That's what the Soviet Union did. And that's what we're doing here. And that's why we're grateful that Jeremy Lafredo actually went to find out what was happening. He's with Rebel News. He joins us tonight. Jeremy, thanks so much for coming on. I'm certain you will be attacked as a tool of Putin, but let's ignore that and get to what you saw there. It looked from the grocery store that sanctions are not hurting Moscow too badly.
Yeah, I was on my way to Russia and I saw the New York Times said that there's Soviet-era shortages. The Washington Post said something along the lines of that there's essential goods scarcity. Foreign policy, they put out a report that said that the economy in Russia is in a black hole that's, of proportion that's never been seen before. And so, I was a little nervous going there. And, I went to rural areas outside of Moscow, and I went to grocery stores like you just saw, and things were cheap, and they had more things than the Whole Foods here in New York City. And what is the goal? What is the goal of these sanctions? The goal is obviously to cause unrest, shortages, make people unhappy with the government. Hopefully people will take to the streets, and at the end of the day, we want regime change in Russia. Right. We want a different government. But as you can tell, that's not happening. No. I spoke to hundreds of people in Russia, and they fit into about 3 different categories of how they feel about the sanctions. The first category of people, they consider themselves Russian patriots, and they don't care if they can't use Netflix. They don't care if Spotify's gone. They don't care if they can't send money overseas. They believe in the cause, and they support their government. And then another group of people, maybe you would consider them, liberals. We have them everywhere. And they oppose the sanctions only because they can't go on vacations. They can't, watch Netflix. And they oppose the war because they oppose the sanctions. They just want to live how they normally live, which is a relatively comfortable lifestyle. And then the other group of people, they don't even notice anything's happening. Maybe they just buy food at the store. The gas is cheap. They drive around. They're not affected at all by these sanctions.
Right. Well, the point undergirding all of this is we're affected by the sanctions, and so is Western Europe, and they're crushing our economies. So let me just ask you very quickly, just for the record, were you accompanied by a Putin government minder? Was your reporting dictated or driven or steered by anyone from the Putin government?
No one from the government, any government was with me. I was by myself, walking around documenting what I was seeing.
And we're grateful that you did, because more information, the free flow of information, is essential in a democracy. Jeremy Lafredo, thank you so much. So no president in American history has ever turned his guns on his own population in the way Biden and his staff did on the unvaccinated. They told you the unvaccinated were going to kill you. Remember that? It was a pandemic of vaccinated. Well, they haven't given that up, even though, of course, the science proves that's insane. Now they're telling you that the unvaccinated are dangerous drivers. Not making that up. Next. So the previous administration used a regulation known as Title 42 to try and keep human waves of foreign nationals from coming into this country on public health grounds, because there was a COVID pandemic. But the Biden administration, which is actively trying, and in fact succeeding in changing the population of the United States, has decided to end Title 42. It expires in just a few days. So what do you think the result will be? Well, huge number, many thousands of people from all over the world waiting at the U.S. border in Mexico to come across. The journalist Jorge Ventura just shot this footage from El Paso.
Here we actually have a massive group of migrants waiting to get into the country illegally. We have migrants from all over. We met migrants from Ecuador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Cuba. Right now, the majority are from Nicaragua. This line just continues to get longer, but the majority here, Nicaragua, Venezuelans, Cubans, Ecuadorians, who right now are waiting to get in.
Jorge Ventura shot that tape for us. He's a reporter with the Daily Caller. He joins us tonight. Jorge, thanks so much for coming on. It's hard to get perspective from videotape, but that looked like an enormous number of people.
Yeah, Tucker, right now we're seeing an absolute disaster here in El Paso. I've been spending time on the Mexican side in Ciudad Juarez, and I've been covering the border for a while, but what I've seen yesterday is something like I've never seen before. It was a massive, massive line around right now, 2,000 migrants on the border wall, on the other side of the El Paso border wall, waiting to get into the country, and the majority of those migrants that I spoke to, Tucker, were from Nicaragua. They did confirm some of the things I was hearing from our sources, that different cartels are fighting over these migrants in the route to Ciudad Juarez. The migrants mentioned to me that they've been extorted also by Mexican police. On the U.S. side, Tucker, Border Patrol officials here are so overwhelmed, and local shelters are so overwhelmed. We're seeing a mass release of migrants onto the streets. We're averaging between 1,200 per day are being released to the streets, and basically are being forced to sleep on the cold streets of downtown El Paso, including children here, Tucker. It's a true humanitarian crisis, and they only expect the situation to get worse once Title 42 expires. They're saying that they could reach up to 4,500 illegal crossings per day just here in El Paso.
So Texas has a Republican governor called Greg Abbott. He has the National Guard at his disposal. Is there any idea why he's not sending them to seal the border? And if it provokes a military conflict, well, I mean, this is an invasion. Like, have you heard anybody suggest he might do that?
We haven't heard anything quite yet, Tucker. Now, we know that he has Operation Lone Star, but the massive waves of migrants have just overwhelmed officials all throughout South Texas, including to the point where local police have to now assist Border Patrol agents in dealing with the migrants. The issue here, Tucker, is the cartels have essentially all control of the southern border. They're able to pick out spots where they're able to overwhelm officials, and when they do this, Border Patrol then has to call in other agents from checkpoints, and that's how we're seeing the fentanyl continue to come into the country. But what we're seeing here, Tucker, is it's a true humanitarian crisis, and the thing is, the situation doesn't seem to get any better. Here, the Democratic mayor refuses in El Paso to declare an emergency, and local officials are continuing to mount that pressure on the mayor to declare an emergency, as they expect it to reach 4,500 illegal crossings per day. But as we're speaking right now, Tucker, there's 2,000 migrants lined up, with more groups continuing to come in, and they're continuing to come into the border because, according to the migrants that I speak with, they believe that the border is open.
Yeah, well, they're right, as you've demonstrated. Jorge, I appreciate your coming on tonight. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Tucker.
So it wasn't too long ago that the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, was talking about people who didn't want the COVID shot, like he was going to pin little IDs on their chests and round them up. They were evil, he said. He even compared them to drunk drivers at one point. Watch.
And with all due respect, you don't have a choice to go out and drink and drive and put everybody else's lives at risk. That's the equivalent of this moment with the deadliness and efficiency of the Delta virus.
So he's never apologized for that. That turned out to be completely 180 degrees from the truth. The majority of people dying from COVID at this point are vaccinated. But that idea that we should single out a group of Americans and treat them like subhumans still exists, unfortunately. Jason Rance is our correspondent in the Northwest. He joins us tonight with an update. Hey, Jason.
Hey, Tucker, there's new research out of the country that tells you unvaccinated truckers are domestic terrorists. That is, pretending vaccination status actually corresponds with risky driving. It's the latest effort to shame the unvaccinated while perhaps maybe line the pockets of insurance companies. So Dr. Donald Rodelmeyer at the Sunnybrook Research Institute, he claimed that motorists that skipped the COVID vaccine demonstrated traffic risks 50 to 70% more frequently compared to those who got the shot. He wrote in the study published in the American Journal of Medicine, he said, quote, "This does not mean COVID-19 vaccination directly prevents traffic crashes. Instead, it suggests that adults who do not follow public health advice may also neglect the rules of the road." So let's buckle up and actually get through this junk study. Because the study looks at crashes that landed all victims in the hospital. So in other words, if a vaccinated driver hits two unvaccinated pedestrians and they all go to the hospital, the data reflects one unvaccinated victim as a risky driver and two unvaccinated victims as risky drivers as well. So one vaccinated victim plus two unvaccinated drivers who are pedestrians who end up becoming victims, even though they didn't actually drive. So what effectively they do are skew the data to disfavor the unvaccinated. Same if the driver didn't actually go to the hospital, but the unvaxxed pedestrians did. So it counts the two unvaxxed as risky, but not the actual driver who didn't go to the hospital and happens to be vaccinated. Now, what's not in the data is who's actually responsible for the crash. Now, that info could obviously show that the vaccinated disproportionately cause accidents. Using the researchers' approach, we can actually argue the government banning the unvaccinated from using public transportation, that forced them to drive. So in other words, we can say actually Justin Trudeau is actually causing the accidents. Now, it is such an unserious study, you actually might wonder why it gets published at all. This is a conclusion from the paper. Quote, the observed risks might also justify changes to driver insurance policies in the future. So basically they're saying get the shot or pay higher insurance rates.
Why not just put them in camps? I mean, that's clearly what they'd like to do. Let's just cut out the middleman. Jason Rantz, really a stunning story. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Tucker.
So of all the medical experts who were censored for asking questions about the COVID lockdown, maybe the most shocking was a physician called Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. He was one of the world's experts on these questions, and he wasn't allowed to speak. He was recently restored to Twitter, thankfully. He joins us next to tell us what he learned from the experience. We'll be right back. Until the files came out, the Twitter files, we had no idea how extensive it was. Turns out it was very extensive, during COVID especially. And the people who were blacklisted, who were prevented from speaking freely on Twitter, weren't just people who were making up the science. It wasn't just people who were making CBD paste at their kitchen table that they should be allowed to speak to. It was exactly some of the people you would talk to first when a pandemic arrives, including Dr. Jay Bhattacharya of Stanford. Bhattacharya was knocked off, was punished for saying correctly the universal lockdowns were not the way to respond to COVID. But now he's back. He was just invited to Twitter's headquarters by its new owner, Elon Musk. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya joins us tonight. Doctor, thanks so much for coming on. Of all people, it was stunning to see you blacklisted, to see you censored. What did Elon Musk say to you when you went to visit him?
Well, I found out there that I was actually blacklisted the day I joined Twitter. I joined in August 2021, mainly because I wanted to tell the public that we didn't need lockdowns, we didn't need school closures to manage the pandemic, that in fact there were other ways to do it by protecting vulnerable people. I was put on a trend blacklist the moment I joined. And what just the audience knows, what that means is that I write a tweet, my followers see the tweet, but on the trend blacklist, make sure that people outside of my followers don't see the tweet. It was something that was designed to make sure that my message didn't get out to the broader population. And what I also found out was that it was at the request of unspecified agents, unclear who, either inside or outside Twitter, that I was put on this trend blacklist. Which, by the way, I'm still on a trend blacklist, even up until just a week ago, I guess. There's a case I've been involved with involving the Attorney General's office in Missouri and Louisiana and the NCLA, this New Civil Liberties Alliance, where we found that government actors across a dozen federal agencies were in contact with Twitter, with social media, telling these social media companies, what to censor, and in many cases who to censor regarding COVID information. It was a policy designed to make sure the American public did not hear that there were other alternative scientific views than just lockdown, lockdown, lockdown.
What this does, I mean, this is pretty amazing on a lot of levels, but the most basic is they told us that they were following the science and it was our moral duty to do the same. But you were practicing the science. Of all people to censor, the Stanford professor physician who specializes in this stuff, seems like he'd be the last person you'd censor, correct?
I mean, the key thing here, Tucker, that I think that folks need to know, what they wanted to do, and this I think is government actors and also old media, old owners of Twitter, they wanted to create this illusion of consensus about the science.
That's right.
That didn't actually exist. They wanted to fool people into thinking that we were following the science, when in fact there was a robust debate among scientists about what the right thing to do was. And the consequence is schools closed, businesses closed, unvaccinated people lost their jobs because of mandates, even though none of the science none of the persuasive science actually supported any of those positions. People suffered as a consequence of this censorship, and of course, it's an abstract violation of my civil rights, my First Amendment rights. But that's not the important thing. The important thing is that American people were denied a debate, an honest debate. And I believe that had that honest debate taken place, none of those policies would have been put in place, and all of that suffering could have been avoided.
The point was, as you put it, to create the illusion of consensus, and I think that's a perfect way to put it. And it's not just on this topic that they're doing it. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, really appreciate your coming on tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
So some people begin to ask the question, like, what happened in the midterm elections? Here you have the Republican Party in Washington, the RNC, raising and spending millions of dollars in the cycle, and yet Republicans turn out a pretty disappointing, very disappointing result. So the question is, where did all that money go? What did they spend it on exactly? It wasn't get out the vote efforts, obviously. We have part of the answer next. So Ronna Romney McDaniel has run the RNC, the Republican National Committee in Washington, the Republican Party in Washington, for nearly 6 years. And she's raised a lot of money. She's good at that. But the party has been losing a lot of elections. So Red State Online, the news site, decided to look into this. Where's all the money going? And Red State found that under Ronna Romney McDaniel, the RNC has spent more than $60,000 at clothing retailers, more than $300,000 on floral arrangements. Quite a few expenditures were effectively hidden because they were put in the wrong categories. According to Red State, quote, nearly $5,000 spent in 2022 at Lululemon, a luxury athletic brand, was classified as an office expense. Tens of thousands went to Broadway shows and NFL tickets. In a statement, the RNC said Red State had published a blatantly false piece because all the spending amounts to around 1% of the money Ronna McDaniel raised. But the most fascinating part of the piece was how much was spent on private planes, a remarkable amount. And then Red State, you should take a look at this, compared spending at the RNC to spending at the DNC, which did pretty well in the last election, and found they weren't spending a lot of money on stuff like that, like private planes and Lululemon. They were spending money on winning elections, which is why they did. So our friend John Rich is a songwriter, obviously a singer, a famous performer, and also an RNC donor. He saw this, and we were interested in his reaction. John, thanks so much for coming on. So I think like a lot of our viewers, like a lot of people in America, you sent money to the party you vote for, and you thought it was going to the right places. What was your response to this story?
Well, it's bad enough how they spent the money, as you're outlining, but here's where I really, really got upset, Tucker, and that's when I realized that the RNC, right after this election, when Trump lost the election, they were running commercials on TV that said, we're fighting for Trump, so donate to the RNC because we're fighting for Trump. And they knew that all the conservative base out there was fired up and would send in a lot of money. Matter of fact, they sent in close to $200 million to the RNC. Meanwhile, I find out that in the back rooms where nobody's allowed to go, that the attorneys for the RNC decide that they're going to hit the attorneys for Trump and say, cease and desist, sit down and shut up, you're ruining the future of the Republican Party, while they're simultaneously running ads saying, fighting for Trump. So when I saw that go down, I said, these people are scoundrels, they're liars, this is a bait and switch. They are abusing their position with the conservatives around this country. And I don't think we should call them rhinos anymore after what I've seen them do there, because that's honestly, that's defamatory to the noble rhinoceros. That's quite an animal. I wouldn't call them that anymore. I would call them Judas Republicans, because they betrayed the trust of the people. They took their money, and they never intended on using that money for what they said they were going to use it for. I'd like to see hashtag Judas Republicans trending from this point forward. We cannot trust what they're doing, and until they have new leadership that we can trust, that speaks like us and talks like us and supports what we support, don't send them another red cent. I know I won't, and I hope nobody else does either.
Wow, that's quite an indictment. I mean, of course, you need two parties, you need two-party leaderships, you need to have a functioning party, right? Are you convinced that if you had better leadership, it would get better?
You know, I think if it's handled, in the right way, if you're not lying to people. I mean, Tucker, you take $200 million out of the pockets of hardworking Americans during a pandemic and say, we're fighting for Trump. It was a lie the entire time, and the attorney that was sending those letters back to the Trump campaign still works there, by the way. They said he was fired. He wasn't fired. He still works there. And you can't trust these people. Listen, I'm a regular guy. I have a pretty incredible life, but I'm a regular guy, as you well know. I don't like being lied to. And I think we should hold them to account. No more money till they start telling the truth.
Wow. Wow. John Rich, speaking more clearly than anyone in D.C. Great to see you tonight. We'll be right back.